Folks who've listened to this show, both in our prior incarnation on the radio and now here at our new home, what we call Coalition 2.0 at Go Local Live, know that one of my primary reasons for living the last few years has literally been to defeat the attempt by an out-of-control government to use taxpayer dollars to subsidize hashtag 38 Stadium. Originally here in Providence, and as I looked across the Providence skyline, I failed to see that which I was told would be impossible to stop. And of course, I'm talking about the then Prov Sox incarnation of the Providence Paw Sox Stadium. And yet 2 years later, here we go again. Just a few weeks ago, Senator Ruggieri decided to announce that it was too late in the legislative session to pursue this type of controversy, this type of imposition, if you will, on the taxpayers. Yet again this week, media sources friendly to Mayor Grebian tweeted out that in fact Mayor Grebian is attempting a last-ditch, last-minute effort to try and do the late-night shuffle that Providence and Rhode Island is so famous for, a midnight run, if you will, to try and pass enabling legislation to get the stadium. So here we go again, folks. And it was time to bring on an expert, someone with no skin in the game, if you will, someone from out of state. He's a recognized expert, a PhD in economics. He's a graduate, I believe, of St. Olaf University, and what we refer to here as the Minnesota Ivy League. He's a professor of economics at the College of the Holy Cross. He's joining us via Skype. I'm talking about none other than Professor Victor Matheson. Professor Matheson, welcome to the Coalition. God bless. And you will always be known in this state as the gentleman who drew the business equivalent, a metaphor, if you will, of comparing the original Providence baseball stadium to the economic activity of a multiplex theater. If there was ever a line that resonated with Rhode Islanders, it was that. Welcome aboard. It was great to have you.
Well, thanks for having me.
Now, let's set the picture here. What's more American than a baseball stadium? Here in the scenic hills of Rhode Island, nestled amongst the abandoned mill buildings of Pawtucket, what could be more American, what could be more gratifying, more wonderful, more beneficial to a community than a municipally owned baseball stadium, Mom, Apple Pie, Chevrolet, a year-round entertainment facility for which you could have concerts and events? What's the problem with that? Why shouldn't taxpayers be running pell-mell to just divest of themselves of the few shekels left of them in Rhode Island to run and support this thing? What could possibly go wrong?
Well, so the real question is, what is the role of government, and should it be the role of government to provide entertainment for everyone out there? And so certainly if you're a baseball fan, nothing better than having government pay for a bunch of your entertainment. On the other hand, you might be a big fan of, again, movies. That's what you were talking about earlier. Why shouldn't we then subsidize movie theaters? Or, I like going out for sushi. I'm one of these elitists, right, that like sushi. So why shouldn't we subsidize sushi restaurants? A lot of people get their entertainment from shopping. Why shouldn't we subsidize? If we're simply saying that let's go subsidize everything that people can go have fun at, that basically means government's going to be subsidizing everything, and that doesn't leave a whole lot of money left in taxpayer pockets or a lot of money left for other more essential government services.
Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that you've been quoted in almost all the major business magazines as a go-to source on this. You've appeared as talking heads across the media spectrum. I enjoyed your commentary on then the attempt to finance the Olympics in 2024 in Boston. What is the track record nationally of minor league sports teams, in particular teams, fulfilling their promise in terms of generating economic activity?
So if you look at the record overall, in general, sports tend to be a fairly poor economic investment for municipalities. That being said, we do have some good examples of stadiums being, say, anchors for very, very localized neighborhood economic development. So, for example, if you want to justify a Paw Sox stadium saying, look, we want to pour a bunch of money into one very specific part of Pawtucket to develop that one small area, we do have some evidence that sports stadiums can do that. However, in terms of generally increasing economic activity region-wide, there's simply no evidence that that happens.
Now, if you look at cities across the country, there's been a spate of these recently, and I'll point out, you've got a couple of stadiums that went up in Georgia, both on the major and minor league level. You've got Hartford, you've got Richmond. This year's buzzword, last year was transparent. This year's buzzword in Rhode Island is ancillary development. Have you seen successful efforts or successful results at this quote-unquote ancillary development? And why don't you, if you could, define for our listeners and viewers what they mean by ancillary development?
Yeah, so what ancillary development would mean is that the taxpayer subsidizes the stadium, but then the neighborhood in the stadium grows up around that, and you have all sorts of businesses move into the area near the stadium. And so what the taxpayer loses on the stadium itself, they gain in the economic development in the neighborhood around that. Mm-hmm. So we do actually have some fairly successful examples of that. So for example, if you've ever been out to San Diego, they have the Gas Lamp District. That is anchored by Petco Stadium, where the Padres are. Coors Field in Lodo, in Denver, lower downtown. That's another very fun and exciting entertainment district that, again, got a big shot in the arm by putting a stadium there and all the people who go through there. How stadium you see like that, you also see a stadium like the new Comiskey Field, U.S. Cellular Park in Chicago, which is basically a big walled fortress surrounded by a moat of parking lots that has essentially no economic development. And what the baseball team has done is successfully driven all of the economic activity anywhere around that stadium inside the stadium where they can profit in it, rather than developing any sort of neighborhood around the stadium.
Isn't that the goal of most big footprint, taxpayer-supported organizations like this? When it comes to casinos, shopping malls, baseball stadiums, there's really no economic motivation other than getting the initial approval for them to spin that business outside. Aren't ultimately their business plans based largely on them internalizing those revenue opportunities?
Well, no, so that's exactly right. Baseball teams and football teams, they're not generally in the business of local neighborhood economic development. They're in the business of revenue generation through baseball or basketball or football. And so, if you're the Chicago Cubs, you don't actually want that baseball fan to come before the game and have a beer in Murphy's bleachers outside the stadium and then go for 6 innings and then leave near the end of the game to go to the Coffee Bear afterwards. Because every person buying a beer outside the stadium is a person not buying a beer inside the stadium. So actually, the baseball teams themselves, it's not in their best interest and it's not in their incentive to try to develop a great neighborhood around the stadium, because they want to be selling all those activities inside the stadium walls rather than outside.
When you look at areas like Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and we love Pawtucket here, very often folks now, and I was one of the first, I think, to describe Pawtucket as the Brooklyn, the creative Brooklyn, if you will, to Providence's Manhattan. There's some organic economic activity. There are pubs that have popped up, the artist community that have largely fled Providence to get into a more affordably priced Pawtucket. That activity is organic. Is it possible, or is there a track record anywhere of government, minus giving away huge subsidies, of being able to generate that type of organic activity? Or does it, whether it be a Soho in Manhattan, a Greenwich Village, or any one of a number of arts areas, say in San Francisco, doesn't that activity have to be generated by a set of organic, ingredients, if you will, that have to exist before that can magically happen?
Yeah. So I wouldn't say it can never happen. What I would say, however, is that it's a whole lot easier to pour a bunch of money in and build a big stadium. We know how to build big stadiums. We know how to pour concrete. We know how to do that sort of thing. It's really hard to build that local neighborhood bar that everyone wants to go to and generates traffic day after day after day after day. And I think that's something that generally, urban planners, both who are private and government and academic, have a much more difficult time figuring out how we make really, really fun, exciting, livable neighborhoods, because that's a much more difficult thing than building a stadium that's really cool. As long as you have the money to do that.
Well, and there seems to be an entire cottage industry, if you will, of consultants only too happy to provide, and these are my words, not yours, grotesquely inflated revenue and attendance projections onto these facilities. Do you see a trend nationwide where they always seem to be paint these rosy pictures? I want to point out, and this is my point. Here in Rhode Island, the firm that's doing the revenue projections under the study paid for by the taxpayers of Pawtucket actually was the same firm that did the Ryan Center. And according to Go Local Prov reporting, they overestimated over a finite period of time in excess of 1 million extra attendees that were going to go to the Ryan Center. That never did. So how do you find reliable projections, as far as potential economic activity, when it seems like every time it's the people sponsoring the project who coincidentally are sponsoring the consultants?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions there in your statement. So first of all, when it comes to these, what I would also term grotesque economic impact statements, economists, when we say the word inflategate, we're thinking about a totally different thing than the typical
right.
fan here in New England.
Right.
Because again, we always see these numbers inflated, and we often have a quick rule of thumb. Basically, take whatever the consultants tell you, move the decimal place one place over to the left, and that's probably a much better estimate about what you're actually going to get. There's some real difficulties associated with doing economic impact statements. So, they have a hard job. One of the major issues is, let's say you do have a bunch of people going to a new stadium in Pawtucket. The question is where those people are coming from and what would they have been doing instead. So, for example, if you have this great new neighborhood around a stadium developed with group hubs and exciting restaurants and things like that, the question is, what is that person in that local group hub, that ancillary economic development? What would that person have been doing otherwise? And if you only count the benefits of new people going to the neighborhood near the ballpark and don't count costs of that restaurant that's a couple miles away that no longer gets that activity, then you're going to get these grossly inaccurate numbers. And of course, then you have all the regular problems with having, just hugely inflated numbers and very optimistic numbers all the time. That's obviously a secondary issue.
Right, bingo. And this is our concern because in Rhode Island, folks, there is this astonishing track record of, shifting, if you will, from one side of the ledger, economic activity. Now, one only has to look at the Providence Place Mall. Ultimately, the state has failed to provide, in the run-up to it or post-analysis, any sort of interpretation of where that business is coming from. Originally, prior to the establishment of something called the Nada Collection and the redevelopment of certain Brookline area malls, the notion was that this mall was going to attract people from out of state. Now, anecdotally, because the government that's pushed this, and I use the term pushed euphemistically, that pushed this, fails to provide us with the numbers of how many folks they essentially just siphoned out of downtown Providence, how many people they siphoned out of Cranston, the now moribund, nearly broken Warwick Mall structure, and in fact, are we just moving from column A to column B? And ultimately, Professor, from your experience, and this is, we're looking at rules of thumb, we're looking at generalizations here, but minor league baseball teams, do they attract much of a tourist crowd? Oh, did I lose you?
Oh, you lost me for a minute, but I think we're back now.
All right, so do minor league baseball teams in an inner city area, in a mill town, do they attract significant tourism dollars from out of state?
So we don't have a whole lot of evidence, particularly the minor league teams generate a whole lot of out-of-state business. Typically, we find for a major league team, roughly 20% of attendees at any given time are from out of the region.
Right.
Minor league teams are probably below that, and below that by a significant margin. But it should even in this case be pointed out that unless people are traveling to a city specifically to go to a game, even then it's not like that baseball team is actually generating new economic activity. So I'll give you an example here from me. At the end of the month, I am going to an economics conference, hanging out with a bunch of other sports economists in San Diego. I am going to go to a baseball game while I'm there, so I'm going to be an out-of-towner spending money at a ballpark that you would normally think should be economic activity that's generated by that team. But if the Padres had been out of town that weekend, I would have gone somewhere else and spent my money elsewhere in San Diego. So even in this case, the Padres aren't generating new economic activity, despite the fact that an out-of-towner is coming and spending money at the ballpark, because I would have been in town anyway, and I'm only going to the ballpark instead of spending money elsewhere in San Diego.
And so, and this brings us to me to a critical point. True or false, and again, we're applying generalizations here, but true or false and we're going to discuss some very basic economics here. The amount of disposable income in any one economic area, and I'll define that as essentially southern Rhode Island in this case on up into southeastern Massachusetts. That amount of money is relatively finite, isn't it?
Yeah, so that's correct. And so I think I see where you're going here is that if you build a new stadium and you direct additional dollars into people spending money at the ballpark, that almost necessarily means that you have to be spending less at other entertainment options in the local area. And so the Pawtuckets don't generate a huge amount of new economic activity in Pawtucket or in Rhode Island. They mainly just shift around where people are actually spending their entertainment dollars.
Right. And to your earlier point, if, let's just say hypothetically, and because this is an issue we're going to cover later in the show in a separate segment, but hypothetically, if you're the town of Cumberland, which as a town directly abuts Pawtucket, if you will, essentially, and also directly abuts the other state-sponsored monopolistic entertainment facility in the state, and that, of course, is the Twin River gambling, quote-unquote, casino in Lincoln, Rhode Island. You essentially, and please jump in, correct me if I'm wrong, the government is artificially subsidizing the cost of two monopolistic entertainment-based venues directly abutting towns like Cumberland, Central Falls, and Woonsocket, and acting as sort of an economic vacuum cleaner. As Ross Perot would have said, that giant sucking sound is the money that could be potentially spent at Cumberland or Central Falls businesses and moving it out to these two monopolistic activities. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's a fair statement. So again, those sort of big entertainment destinations tend to have locals spend their money there rather than in other local towns throughout Rhode Island.
Right. Now, and I'll allow you to define this because you're much better at this than I am. Let's talk about something called the multiplier effect. Now, I took Samuelson. To date myself, I took Paul Samuelson in 1979. I don't think I did well on the course, but it's amazing how certain basic tenets of the Samuelson Economics 101 course remain with me. And one of them is the discussion of the multiplier effect. Perhaps you can explain to my audience what the multiplier effect is.
Yes, the multiplier effect, local economy, any money that then gets spent and respent again and again. So an example would be, let's imagine you go to a restaurant or a brew pub in downtown Pawtucket. You leave a nice tip for your server then takes that tip and goes and gets a haircut the next day. That barber then goes and spends the money they made on the haircut, buying flowers from the local florist, and so that money gets spent multiple times. So any direct economic impact gets multiplied by this respending.
Right.
This is a real effect. This is certainly something that if you are trying to boost up what you think is going to happen and what you're trying to report as economic impact, there's a lot of ability to falsify data in ways to make your impact look bigger. But at a very fundamental level, there is no doubt that a direct economic impact happens, and then there is an indirect multiplier or spillover effect that happens after that effect.
Is there any functional difference between the multiplier effect of an individual attending, say, a Pawtucket Red Sox game versus, say, having dinner out at one of the wonderful restaurants that are on Broad Street or Mendon Road in Cumberland or Central Falls? Is there any real difference whatsoever?
So the highest multiplier effect is going to go where you have the most local people making the money. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you have a locally owned restaurant, almost certainly everyone in that restaurant is going to be hired from the local population. The owner themselves and any profits the restaurant makes, they're locals. So when you put money in a local restaurant and spend your money there, that's likely to have the highest multiplier effect. When you go to a chain restaurant, right, so you go to Olive Garden, you still have a bunch of local servers making the money, but Olive Garden, which is owned by Darden Enterprises, I don't know where their corporate headquarters are, but they're sucking a bunch of that money to corporate headquarters in New York City or St. Louis or wherever that is, and so a bunch of that money leaves town. The Red Sox are probably about the worst of the bunch because professional sports at the major league level, about half of your money winds its way in major league ball players' pockets, and almost none of that money is spent locally because most of the Red Sox don't live in Boston. They live all over the country, but not locally. So their earnings don't get spent in the local economy.
Right. Now, add a factor. Now, again, I'm going back a long time. So again, Professor, feel free to correct me. But there's a concept in economics called rents. And rents is not, I'm not talking about the money you pay to your apartment, your landlord. I'm talking about transfer payments to government. So my understanding is that if in fact the government is involved in any one of these equations, whether it be in the case of Twin River, where a significant amount of the money actually goes to, as we libertarians say, the government, and eventually mow roads, or in the case of the Pawtucket facility, where there is going to be at some level of economic participation by the city/state, depending on who ultimately pays these bonds, you have a less efficient multiplier effect than, say, a purely capitalistic, arm's length, private business to individual, or private business to private business transaction. Is that a fair statement, Counselor?
Yeah, so that's right. So what we have here, that's what's known as deadweight loss. And whenever you have to collect taxes, that adds inefficiencies in. I think the easiest way to think of this, if you're not an economist, is basically the government adds a middleman. And anytime there's a middleman in there, there's inefficiencies that occur. So you would typically not want to fund things through government taxation unless you can't get those services any other way, or if the private market has a significant problem providing services. So in things like healthcare, we can talk about those things. When you talk about basic entertainment like baseball, there's no reason that private markets, though, on their own can't function just perfectly.
Right. So when you look at a per seat tax or some type of additional gross receipts tax levied upon those folks who are in attendance at said Pawtucket Red Sox games, then effectively you're providing yet again you're providing yet another barrier to success for that Mull craves so badly. That's really the juice, if you will, the economic juice that runs an economy and creates growth and opportunities for people in that designated economic zone.
Right. And I think the real issue is, so let's imagine you're trying to figure out how to, I can speak for essentially every economist out there who's looked at stadium economics, and says the way that should be funded is by having the people who own the team and the people who go and watch baseball, they're the ones who should be funding that. Now, if you're going to insist on having the taxpayer have a role here, then you might ask yourself, okay, so what's the best way to do that? Probably the best way to do that, where you have the least concern from economists, is at least having a tax on, at least the users of the facility are paying the majority of the cost of it. The worst thing that would happen is something like a general tax on, on cigarettes, or a tax on lottery tickets, or gambling revenues, or income taxes, or general sales taxes. Right. Because at that point, not only do you have all of these deadweight losses, but you're not even taxing the people who are getting the benefit of the state.
Right.
So kind of in the whole hierarchy of what you want to do, people should pay for their own stadium. If they're not going to pay for their own stadium, user taxes are probably the best of the alternatives. But even there, most economists would say that's not really fair. I mean, think about me as a homeowner, for example. If I had a user pays tax, basically I would say, look, I built a new house here in my town in Massachusetts that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And so what I want you to do is I want you to apply my property tax to my mortgage bill. Well, that at least is kind of fair, I guess, except for, my property tax is going to try to contribute to the general welfare. And when you are allowing user taxes to go just to paying for a facility, then, they're not paying their full share of just making government run in general.
Have you seen out there any real appetite for private financing for these type of stadiums? And just as a backdrop, I want to note that the owners of this enterprise, the Pawtucket Red Sox, are players on an international level. Terry Murray is the former CEO of Fleet Bank. Mr. Ryan is the former CEO of CBS Corporation. Clearly, we're not talking about let's just say the everyday successful, average, super successful local businessmen. These are individuals with clear access to capital markets, with clear track records in managing large multinational, sophisticated consumer operations. Why is there an appetite out there? Why wouldn't they just simply go to the private markets and say, hey, this is such a great investment. I want to make all the steam off of it. I want complete control. Loan me some money. Let's issue some bonds, whatever. Why doesn't that ever seem to happen?
Well, it does happen occasionally, and so let's call out some of the good guys. So, for example, Robert Kraft built his own stadium at Gillette Stadium with his own money. Now, mind you, he tried to extort some money out of Massachusetts and Hartford, and it didn't work out. But in the end, he said, look, I want a stadium, and I've got the money I should be paying for. Santa Clara, where the 49ers are playing in the stadium, that's about 90% privately financed as well. So TD Bank North Garden here in Boston, again, another privately financed facility. So we do see some. The real reason that you don't see this in minor league baseball, however, is that a new stadium would probably generate somewhere in the vicinity of $4 to $5 million a year in additional revenue for the Paw Sox every year for the next 10 years or so. That being said, the financing cost for the sort of stadium that they have wanted to build in both downtown Providence and the new one that they're proposing for Pawtucket have financing costs of $6 or $7 million a year for 30 years. The reason they don't do it is because it would make no sense whatsoever to spend $6 or $7 million a year in order to increase their revenues by 4%.
Now, you mentioned an interesting point when you mentioned 10 years, and I'm sure you're throwing that out as an estimate, but it would appear, at least to the casual observer, or someone like myself who is not an expert but literally tries to play one on the radio, it would appear that one of the newest phenomenon is what I'll call zombie stadiums, where you've got stadiums being built and then being declared functionally obsolescent far before these stadiums have either A, reached their often stated, or as you say, highly inflated revenue goals, B, before their useful life, and in some cases it would appear even before the taxpayer pays it off, sort of like a bad car loan. Do you see this as a new trend? Is this starting to happen everywhere?
It certainly happens anywhere where local government officials are not very, very smart about writing appropriate leases. So St. Louis is a good example. Rams left St. Louis, and they left St. Louis for a stadium that was only about 25 years old and still had about 5 years left of debt payments. The same thing, the Montreal Expos abandoned Expo Stadium with about 5 years left of bond payments on that stadium. So you need to be really smart about how you do these, and no matter what happens in Pawtucket, Pawtucket would be absolutely foolish to not have an ironclad lease agreement with the team that lasts at least as long as the bond payments that Pawtucket would be talking about.
Because ultimately, in most of these cases, and it would appear this would be the case here in the Pawtucket situation, the taxpayer, if those revenue projections aren't met, if the team leaves early, if the team gets bankrupt, if the team is sold and then they decide to leave early, oftentimes the taxpayer has been on the hook for this, hasn't they?
Oh yeah, that's certainly right. We've seen plenty of cases where we have taxpayers paying for a completely empty stadium. Again, useful life and the economic life are two totally different things. So Atlanta, we have two new stadiums there for the Falcons and for the Braves, both replacing stadiums that are less than 30 years old. As a matter of fact, the Braves are moving out of a stadium that's younger than Miley Cyrus. And so you have a situation there where you're clearly abandoning stadiums, not because they can't be used anymore, but because the owners are looking for greener pastures.
Right, and much like the Houston Astrodome, which became, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, sort of a metaphor for failed stadiums, these are single-purpose buildings. You really can't reinvent these very well, can you?
Yeah, and that's especially the case with baseball and football. So obviously, Pawtucket has talked about using this stadium for lots of other concerts and other things like this. But the fact is, baseball stadiums are really only good for one thing. They're good for watching baseball games. They are not well designed at all for watching concerts or watching soccer or football or lacrosse or any of these other sort of things. Certainly, the original Providence Pawtucket Stadium, Pawtucket Stadium, well, they were talking about putting huge numbers of concerts and other events in that, and that was always ridiculous. That would be a terrible place to watch a game. And they're kind of fun for a one-off to watch hockey in Fenway, but it's really a terrible place to do anything but watch baseball. Same thing with football stadiums. Gillette gets used very, very rarely outside of football and of course the Revolution soccer team there as well, because there's simply not many events out there that require a 60 or 70,000 seat stadium.
Right.
Yeah, you get a Taylor Swift concert here or there, or you get the Rolling Stones, but there's just not many of those events that come by a year. So basically you're talking about a facility you use 50, 60, 70 times a year and not much beyond that.
And then, so let's also talk about jobs, because if there is a second case of Inflategate seemingly attached to the hip of most of these proposals, it's the notion that Rhode Island's going to get 1 million, 2 million, maybe 10 million jobs out of this. What type of job development post-construction do you often see from a minor league stadium like this? And I guess that's where we almost get into your multiplex theater analogy, isn't it?
Well, so even for a much bigger project, even for Gillette Stadium, for example, even a Major League NFL stadium generates roughly the same number of full-time year-round jobs as a Macy's department store. So these are not gigantic job generators, and of course, outside of Tom Brady and the highly paid athletes, most of the jobs being generated by a professional sports franchise are essentially minimum wage jobs as ushers, as ticket concessionaires. These are not the great jobs. These are not these upper middle class jobs. Basically, they're low level, unskilled, entry level jobs, which of course for lots of people is better than no job at all. But these are hardly gigantic.